Jewish Insights with Justin Pines on JBS is made possible in part by the clubs at Pearl River, New York, luxury rental communities for ages 55 and better, and the B.L. Manger Foundation.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. In addition to the devastation of October 7th itself, we are still understanding the many ripple effects of October 8th. What's happening on the ground in Israel and across Israel's borders, the effect on America and American Jewry, and most recently the explosion of anti-Semitism in Europe. Perhaps a less investigated question is understanding how October 7th and October 8th have shaped Jewish and Israeli Tikkun Olam, the effort to not only protect and care for the Jewish people in the state of Israel, but to spread that justice and that care across the globe to repair the world. My guest today is Dyonna Ginsburg. She is the CEO of Olam, a network of Jewish and Israeli organizations working in the fields of global service, international development, and humanitarian aid. She previously served as Director of Education and Service Learning at the Jewish Agency and was named one of Israel's 50 most inspiring women by Nashim magazine, among many other awards for journalism, Jewish leadership, and education. We've only met in person once for all of 3 minutes at a Zahn Stein-Haynes bar mitzvah, and I have been looking forward to continuing the conversation with her ever since. Welcome.
Great to be here.
How's it going?
Great.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'm just getting over jet lag. I arrived 4 days ago from my home in Jerusalem.
Wow. All right, doing the tour. Okay, well, we're thrilled to have you here. Before we get into Tikkun Olam after October 7th and Tikkun Olam before October 7th and Olam, we've never had you on JBS before. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit to our crowd here?
Great.
Or to me, because since I don't know anything either. I don't even know where you're from.
I am originally from New York, born and bred. I grew up in Long Island, first in Bethpage and then in Woodmere.
Cool.
I grew up in a very Jewishly identified and involved home. My father is a conservative rabbi. My mother is Israeli. And grew up with a love of the Jewish people and of Israel. I moved to Israel straight out of college in 2002 in the height of the Second Intifada. And originally went into
Was that always the plan? Like you growing up, you're like, I got to get through college and then I'm going off to Israel? Or something in college made you do that? What's the story? Give me something.
So already in high school, I had the thought in my mind. And then I spent a year in Israel in a yeshiva studying prior to doing my undergraduate degree in Columbia University. And then when
Which yeshiva, just while we're keeping track? Which yeshiva?
MMY.
Okay, great. Keep going.
And when I was a sophomore in college, my younger sister also spent a gap year in Israel after high school, and she decided to stay. And when I was a senior in college, my younger brother, who also did a gap year, decided to stay in Israel. So by the time I graduated college, my two younger siblings had stolen my thunder.
Wow.
And it made sense. And I think a lot of people at that point in time were trying to figure out what they wanted to do professionally, academically, so it felt like a natural juncture to move to Israel for me. But I think I was also inspired by the ability to roll up my sleeves and make a difference. I knew that Israeli society was far from perfect, and that wasn't a turnoff for me. That was part of the motivation for why I moved when I did.
Be part of the solution.
Exactly.
Beautiful. I got to ask you one thing. Alana Steinhain, our mutual friend, mentioned to us, was she said you were the head of the Orthodox community at Columbia, and also she remembers you speaking very, very powerfully. I guess she really remembers. It's been some time on 9/11. You were, I guess, talk to me about that for a second. What was that like? Because we'll get into October 7th, but let's start with 9/11.
9/11 was actually the day that I was supposed to open up my file with the Jewish Agency in order to make Aliyah to move to Israel.
Wow.
And
you were a senior?
I was a senior in college.
Okay.
I graduated in 3.5 years, and so it was September. It was several months before I was planning to move to Israel, and I was in class as September 11th happened. a TA came into the class and whispered to the professor. He did not understand, and so class went on as usual. I went back to my dorm room, and it was only upon going back to get my stuff to head out on the subway to open up my Aliyah file that I discovered what was happening. We quickly scrambled. I had been a leader in the Jewish community at Columbia University for a while, and it was so chaotic that day that there was no official response by the university. And people were clamoring for an opportunity to come together. So we did this impromptu prayer service. And much to my surprise, a lot of the people who showed up were not even Jewish. I remember running to the copy machine and photocopying copies of Psalms in English so that we could have both for Jews as well as non-Jews who were showing up to be in community together. I know that Alana remembers me speaking that day, and she shared that with me on several occasions. I actually have no recollection, but what she says I said was
thank God for friends.
Was a verse from the book of Deuteronomy, where it talks about uvacharta b'chaim, you shall choose life in the singular. And what I said was, the reason why it's in the singular is because each and every person has the ability to take actions that have wide-reaching consequences. And what we saw on that very day was individuals took actions that were deeply negative, and that it's up to us to take actions that are positive and that choose life. I don't remember that, but it sounds like the kind of thing I would have said. And it is true, I was a leader in the Columbia Jewish community. To the best of my knowledge, I was the first female leader of the Orthodox community, which at the time was among the largest student groups on campus.
Got it. Okay. And just to review, we've discussed this verse with Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg on here before as well. But it says in Deuteronomy, which I think Alana remembered being the weekly portion that week, actually.
That is correct.
I've set before you the blessing and the curse, choose life. And you're pointing out kind of your drush, as they say, the way that you were taking it to speak to people in that moment was, I've set before you, the Jewish people, blessing and curse, but you, the individual, have the ability to choose life. Beautiful. And so we have seeds planted, I guess, at that time in history, which is that you're already leaning towards going to Israel, and you're already leaning towards trying to encourage people to take action. I'll add you just because I've been thinking about it. I recently had Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamb on here, and he taught me that the people who arrived on the Mayflower said Psalms when they arrived, because Jewish text was very in at the time, apparently. So lest us be surprised that people were saying Psalms at your vigil. Apparently there's been a long history of non-Jews saying Psalms at big moments, which is a wild thing that I recently learned. Anyway, all that said, okay, so you go to Israel to help Israel, but you ultimately end up going to Israel to help Israel help others.
Correct.
Yes.
So I go to Israel first to be involved in Jewish education. I got a master's in Jewish education. I worked in the experiential education world for a while. And then
That's hard, by the way. So you did that at Hebrew University, right?
That is correct.
But you were teaching in Israel.
Yes, I was.
In Hebrew or like
I was
to Americans?
teaching in Hebrew.
Cool.
My mother is Israeli, so
you have skills.
I have a leg up.
Yes.
And as I was working in the field of Jewish education, I got involved in a nonprofit in Israel that was among the first to call itself a Jewish social justice nonprofit. That notion was pretty radical at the time because the notion of ethical behavior being rooted in Jewish tradition is not something that's intuitive to most Israelis, regardless of where they are on the religious spectrum. And
why do you think that is, by the way? I know you're not a historian or whatever.
Or a sociologist.
Yeah, or a sociologist. I literally spoke to Ari Lamb recently, spent the whole time saying that Americans are ethical because it's based in Judaism. And now we have Israelis being like, why would Americans look to Judaism to be ethical? And we're like, why would Israelis like, why would we never look to Judaism to figure out how to be ethical? What do you think's going on there?
I think most Israelis associate Judaism with public ritual or public observance. Jewish holidays, the Sabbath, things that you see in the public square, and individual ethical behavior less so. Although, if you look back to the first chief rabbi, he spoke significantly about ethical behavior, etc. But I think most Israelis would not identify that as a core part of Jewish tradition. So I was involved in this organization first as a volunteer, then as a board member, and then I took over, and that represented my switch from the Jewish education world to the domestic social change world in Israel. Mm-hmm. While I was there, I was involved in founding a network of Jewish social justice and environmental professionals from around the world, because what I noticed was that there were lots of Jews doing similar things. Jews working with vulnerable populations in Tel Aviv were not so different from Jews working vulnerable populations in San Diego. Sure. Yet they were not talking to each other. That's because collaboration is hard, even if you're right next door, all the more so if you're across the ocean, but also because Israel was taboo in the social justice community. And so... Because of its treatment of Palestinians, because of other policies. And so there was not a lot of conversations happening between people working in parallel spheres. And so I was involved in creating this network in order to create dialogue and conversation and collaboration among Israeli colleagues and their counterparts in the Jewish world. And that was my first foray into Jews who were doing work around the world, globally. Fast forward several years and several jobs later, I was approached by several funders who had been funding Jewish or Israeli organizations in the fields of Tikkun Olam, international development, humanitarian aid, global volunteering, and they identified the lack of a convening function and asked me to come aboard. I think what's interesting in terms of my own story is that my universalism comes from a very particular place. I grew up in a family that was deeply rooted in Jewish tradition and observance, deeply rooted in a connection to Israel. It was very clear that I have obligations to my own, but it was really with my move to Israel that for the very first time I started thinking about what's our responsibility to others. So in that initial organization that I ran that was involved in domestic social change efforts, the primary question I asked myself was, what's the responsibility of the Jewish state to non-Jews living in its midst? But more recently, over the last 9 years since I've been with Olam, one of the questions that I contend with is, what's the responsibility of the Jewish state and the Jewish people when we show up in the world and to broader humanity? And so for me, I sort of cut my teeth on working locally, and it's only later that I've now expanded outwards.
Beautiful. So the domestic thing, let's talk about it from Israel's perspective for a second. The domestic thing makes sense. You have people in your society, many countries, I don't know, I can't speak for all, but I assume most countries do some work to help the people that are in their country. This idea of kind of Israel going to the far corners of the world, by the way, American Jews do this as well, of course, is, you know, one of those things that's like an interesting phenomenon, let's say, right? It's like you get like the WhatsApp, like the Jews are the first to arrive in Haiti, or look, you know, that kind of thing. Talk to me about that. What's going on there? What do you make of it? Why is it important? What are the assumptions people are making that are wrong? Why should Israel be running all over the world to do this? Is that fair?
Yes, that is fair.
I'm being critical, obviously, of course. You know, we're you know, we recently read in the Parsha, Abraham is, you know, welcoming guests, so we should be running around saving the world, of course. But I'm sure there are people who are kind of like, oh, that's good PR for Israel. That's why they're doing it.
There are a lot of ways to go about answering this question.
Yeah, we have time.
I'll start by giving a historical perspective. For the vast majority of Jewish history, the Jewish community did not have the ability to exercise its values on a global stage. The world was not globalized in the way that it is now, nor did we have the basic rights and privileges that we do, even in a post-October 7th reality with all the vulnerability that we are now feeling in very real ways. The Jewish community has things that my grandparents could never dream of in terms of resources, in terms of, you know, if you go back several generations, the right to vote, the right to own property, etc. And so in my mind, it's not a surprise that for most of Jewish history, we were focused first and foremost on our own.
Sure.
It's only in the last half century that we actually have the ability to live out values of human dignity, of tzedek, justice, tzedakah, charity on a global scale. It's also only in the last half century or so that the Jewish community is so deeply embedded in a global world.
Right.
And I'll say that in terms of my own entry into this field, when I first took the job, it actually, I debated because it felt like a values leap, because I am somebody that really believes that charity begins at home. And even though a lot of things on paper aligned really nicely, I actually wasn't sure whether this was the right position for me. I will say that in recent years, particularly since the pandemic and then Ukraine and climate crisis, up until pretty much October 7th, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But it's become clear for me, and it's felt really authentic, that the actions that a person has in one part of the world has tremendous knock-on effects on the very safety or security of people far away. So even from the perspective of interests and not just of values, the Jewish community is deeply embedded in the world. We can't just close our eyes and say we don't have anything to do with anybody else. So whether it's from the perspective of the ability to exercise our values on a global stage, or in terms of just wanting to protect our own and make sure we're safe and secure, etc., we have to be paying attention to larger issues. In terms of Israel, I'll also say that this has been core to Israel's identity from the very early years of the state. Israel, under the leadership of Golda Meir, who was foreign minister at the time, and David Ben-Gurion, who was prime minister at the time, opened up an international development wing of its foreign ministry in 1958. That was exactly 10 years after the founding of the state. And anyone who knows a little bit about early Israeli history will know that the first 10 years, Israel was beset by many challenges. So several wars, massive immigration. In the first 2 years, Israel doubled its population. A huge deficit, high rates of inflation. My mother, who's Israeli, remembers living in the austerity period where they had food rations of 1,600 calories a person. And nevertheless, Israel opened up this branch to be involved in lending expertise to developing countries, particularly in Africa and Asia. And it did so for a variety of reasons, and Israel's early political leaders were honest about that. Economic, diplomatic, Israel was isolated, it was desperate to create relationships around the world, but also moral. And if you read the writings of Golda Meir and David Ben-Gurion, they speak extensively about how they saw this as, quote, a historic privilege and a duty and an extension of Jewish values. And for them, this is what it meant to be a Jewish state. Now, remarkably, they opened up this branch before the United States opened up USAID.
Wow.
It was 3 years before.
Wow.
And they did this when Israel was facing its own deficit, was considered a developing country at the time. Within several years, Israel became a leader in this field. By 1964, it had double the number of international development practitioners than the average of the world's wealthiest countries at the time. And so Israel was really a leader in this field. The story gets a little bit more complicated. So in 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, there was tremendous pressure on African countries to cut off ties with Israel, and all but 4 cut off ties. And so then the Israeli government slashed its budget for this type of work, and it's really nonprofit organizations that have come into the mix since, although the Israeli government is still involved in this. But for me, I think the early period of Israel's investment and the motivations behind that investment are really instructive for the time that we find ourselves in now, where there's a very natural tendency for the Jewish community, for Israel, to turn inwards. But if we look back to the early years of the state, we see that the founding fathers and mothers of the state of Israel believed that scarcity was not an excuse for a lack of generosity, and that there was the ability to show up and do good in the world, even if you're facing your own challenges.
Wow, okay, so many reflections. Pardon me. I got young kids, keep me up late at night, although you're the one who just got off the airplane a couple of days ago. So, first of all, I just want to reflect, this is maybe very random, but I'll just reflect that there's lots of different ways for a country to export itself, let's say. I think of, what's going on with Israel and Palestinians now. Like, there's media, like, trying to get people to tell more stories out there. There's also, like, the stories of how certain Arab countries are using kind of their money to get involved in the sports space and purchase teams and, like, take over leagues and that kind of thing. And it's just interesting to note that, like, the thing that Israel is exporting, I mean, Israel exports a lot of other things now as well, but, like, that early on, they were like, we're going to export, like, helping people. It's just like it's cool, and I like that's about Israel. That's very interesting. The other thing I wanted to ask to kind of, like, not push back, but really understand, you gave the example of kind of when the going got tough with the African countries, we kind of did pull out a little bit, but then nonprofits stepped forward. So there is kind of a history a little bit around, like, okay, we're going to pull back a little bit, but there's also a history of when there's not enough, we're going to go forward anyway. So it sounds like there's, like, almost multiple schools of thought there a little bit, yeah?
Yeah, after 1973, basically public and political support for this work plummeted.
Because people were like, we put in the time and we got nothing back. They left us.
Because
anyway.
People felt betrayed by it. It's interesting, in Golda Meir's memoir, which she wrote after this happened, she has this whole passage in which she says, there are all these cynics who say it was never worth it. And she says two things. One, she says it's short-sighted and that politics and diplomacy is a long game. So obviously there will be setbacks, but that was important work. And then the second thing she says is, even if it was a diplomatic failure, it was an extension of our deepest values.
Right.
And it transforms lives. So even if it didn't pay off in terms of UN votes, it was still worth doing. And she actually talks about the fact that of all the achievements she had in her entire career, the work that she did in Africa was the one of which she's most proud, even though she was writing this after this perceived failure of that operation.
Super interesting. Okay, fine. Very interesting. And then tell me a little bit around Olam itself. So it's an umbrella convening organization for all these different nonprofits. Say a little bit more, yeah?
So Olam is a network of Jewish and or Israeli individuals and organizations that work in the fields of international development, humanitarian aid, and global volunteering, mostly with vulnerable non-Jewish populations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We have 81 partner organizations, all of whom self-identify as Jewish or Israeli and are doing this work. It encompasses lots of different fields. So global health, disaster relief, agriculture, solar technology, education, etc., but working with people mostly who live in extreme poverty around the world.
Who are some of your partners, just so I can get a sense?
In the United States, some of our partners include the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee that has a branch that works in disaster relief and international development, American Jewish World Service, HIAS. Those are some of our partners. In Israel, some of the most well-known are IsraAid, Innovation Africa, and others. Our 81 partner organizations work in 88 countries around the world and collectively have a staff of over 4,000 people.
Wow. It's like Magen David Adom and Hatzalah, is that also?
So United Hatzalah is a partner. Magen David Adom is not. United Hatzalah obviously does the lion's share of their work in Israel, but they're part of Olam's network because of the work that they do abroad. So when they're deployed to respond to an earthquake or a war or crisis happening abroad, They're part of Olam's network in that regard, which involves various trainings and convenings. We're not a foundation, but we give out micro grants to encourage collaboration across the network. We do a lot of coordination, particularly during times of crisis.
Tell me a little bit about that, actually. I'm curious, because that's always, when you have these, God forbid, these crises, like everyone's on the ground at the same time, everyone's trying to raise money. Do you help them navigate that, or it's kind of like, play nicely, everyone? How does that work?
There's definitely work that happens in the immediate days after a crisis.
Yeah.
But I would say most of Olam's focus is in the intervening time between crises, building those relationships so that the organizations know how to connect with one another and make sure that they're not duplicating efforts. Just 2 years ago, we did a piece of research on the Jewish and Israeli humanitarian response to the crisis in Ukraine. And one of the things that was really gratifying to see, and I think Olam was catalytic for some of this, and some of this is just the organizations doing great things on their own, that there was very little duplication of efforts and that these organizations were really playing nicely in the sandbox together.
Very nice. Okay, fine. And out of curiosity, is Aga Hoser Shalom Youth Village one of them?
Yes.
All right, there you go. Cool. I spent 3 weeks there when I was in law school volunteering there.
Wow, I've also been there several times, and they are very close partners of ours.
It's a very special place in my heart. But I figured the way you were describing it, they would probably fit into that.
They are indeed.
It. So you have, and that's one that's that's a youth village in Rwanda for families that were affected by the genocide in Rwanda. That's like a hyper-local example. That's not a place that's like, oh, Israel Aid, we're doing these 10 different things. It's kind of like, we have a place, that's where we do it. Got it.
Yes.
And I'm sure there's a bunch of those as well that are local ones, and you're dealing with the ones that are international and local. Okay, got it. Very interesting. What's the biggest value add that you guys do for them? I know you said creating a network. How do you help all these different places?
I think it varies from organization to organization.
Different needs.
Yeah.
Right.
Medium-sized organizations have different needs than big size and small size. But I think a lot of this work can often feel isolating, and particularly, in the Jewish community, people might not always realize the value of this work or how this work can be emanating out of Jewish values. And so to feel part of something larger that feels amorphous, but it's real.
Sure.
And I would say particularly since October 7th, because the work of our partners has gotten a lot harder since then. Many of our partners have lost funding because Jewish philanthropy has moved to work in Israel or combating anti-Semitism, and also because there are incidents of general philanthropy that has wanted to distance itself from Jewish or Israeli organizations. And some of our partners have experienced strained partnerships, either with funders or other NGOs in the sector. And so their work has gotten a lot harder. And being part of a network where they can think together, strategize, come up with solutions of how they can continue to do their work better and make the case for this work in the Jewish community, that's been really valuable over the past year.
Great. So let's talk about that a little bit. So you're overseeing, you said 81 partner organizations. You bring them together. They're doing their work. Different Jewish and Israeli organizations are all over the world, helping people in all different places. What happens after October 7th?
So first, let me tell you what happens on October 7th.
Oh, great. Thank you. That's great. Fair point. That's October 7th. Yeah.
So I'll speak from a personal place, but it's actually related to one of our partner organizations.
Yeah.
I was in my home in Jerusalem. There were 7 or 8 sirens. We obviously knew something was happening, but because I am an observant Jew, I actually did not turn on my phone until after Havdalah on Saturday night. We had stopped people on the street. They had said that there was, possible terrorist infiltration, possible hostage taking, but the mind can only comprehend what it comprehends. And it wasn't until Saturday night that I turned on my phone, and before I even had the chance to look at the news, I saw a WhatsApp group of mine that was super active. About 15 years ago, I'd participated in a trip of 10 Israeli women activists to San Francisco. And we've become, a group that meets periodically ever since.
So nice.
One of the women in the group, Vivian Silver, who was a peace activist and the founder of one of our partner organizations, Ajik Nisped, wrote to us from her home in Be'eri on the morning of October 7th as terrorists were at her door.
Oh my God.
And then there was radio silence with everybody on the group. It's 10 women, asking how she was. I'll also say that in that group, there were 2 other women who were deeply affected. One woman from Kfar Aza, who luckily was not there on that day, because her house was actually one of the ones where the paragliders came first.
Wow.
At 6:35 in the morning, and another woman whose nephew was a soldier who was killed on that day, and she already knew. So before I even had the chance to look at the news, I saw this WhatsApp group and realized that this was unprecedented and deeply personal. It took 5 weeks until we learned that unfortunately Vivian had been killed in her home on October 7th. And then within several hours, I also learned that one of the CEOs of another partner organization of ours was taken hostage along with 6 members of her family. Thankfully, she was returned in the hostage deal with everyone except her son-in-law, who is still in captivity.
Oh my God.
And in those initial weeks, I, as well as many other people in our network, worked around the clock to secure her release. And also, we thought Vivian was taken captive as well. And so it was very clear that this was deeply personal and far-reaching. 50 of our 81 partners are headquartered in Israel. Until October 7th, many of them had not worked locally. They had only worked abroad, but they reached the same conclusion that I reached right away, which was, this is different than anything we'd seen before. So within days, 17 of them pivoted to do work in Israel using global expertise in psychosocial trauma, mental health, working with displaced populations, agriculture, to support those who were affected. Nova survivors, people from the south, people from the north, etc.
That's doing what they do, but instead of flying into somewhere else, flying into their own country. Not flying, but the metaphor.
Exactly. And, it's interesting because you asked earlier what's one of the critiques of this work. And I would say before October 7th, one of the critiques was that, these are rootless cosmopolitans, they're not connected. It was so clear. The second things were needed at home, people lined up. That is what they did.
You're saying the people who volunteer are not...
The people who volunteer or the people who work in this field or these organizations. A critique was always, why are they helping people far away? Why aren't they working locally? The second it was needed,
they were able to do
it.
That's another good reason that they should be doing their work, so that they have the skills to do that work at home.
Correct. And I would actually say one of the sort of silver lines that we've seen is that it's actually a virtuous circle, or cycle. The work that they do globally inform that the work that they do locally in Israel, and the work that they've done locally in turn has informed the work globally. So we are now more than a year out, and there are CEOs in our network who are still displaced from their homes. One woman that lives about 4 kilometers from the Lebanese border has not been able to be home since October 8th.
Wow.
She runs an organization in India, and she said to me that one of the sort of saving graces of this period is that even though she was always someone who is deeply empathetic and sensitive and culturally sensitive, this experience of displacement helped her better understand the community that she serves in India, and they realized that as well. And so we've actually seen this beautiful thing where people were able to use global expertise at home, and then experiences at home of undergoing trauma, which all of our partners, I shared examples of the most extreme, but everybody to varying degrees underwent serious trauma, was able to then translate that into being kinder, more compassionate, more understanding. There's another CEO of an organization that works in Ethiopia, And there's been a civil war going on in Ethiopia for a while. And she said, actually, the events of this last year have created deeper understanding and camaraderie between the Ethiopian staff and the Israeli staff than there ever was before, because both of them are having this shared horrific experience of war.
Wow. First of all, I'm so sorry to start with. That's, oh my God. That's, we hear from everyone in Israel that everyone's affected, but it sounds like there's almost like a disproportionate number of people in your network that are, were in the south or up north by Lebanon that were affected by this. And it is crazy that they've spent this time helping others and now are in the position of need. And I guess a silver lining is that they're learning what those people are going through, because it's certainly, that gets lost sometimes, the displaced person part of it and all those challenges. Very interesting. Have there been stories of reciprocation, of places that they're helping? I don't know that everyone has the resource. If you're helping people that are in a tough spot, I assume they're not flying into Israel to help, but has there been stories of reciprocation?
I'm not sure about reciprocation, but shows of solidarity.
Yeah, that counts in my book, yeah.
Shows of solidarity. So
I'm trying to imagine my time at Agah Hazar Shalom Youth Village, if you knew that all the staff that were there for the past 2 years now were losing family members or were displaced or had members of the family in the army. I can imagine those kids really getting behind that.
Yeah. So I personally and our own staff received emails right after October 7th and then throughout this year, the eve of the first Iranian attack, etc., from colleagues. Someone wrote to us who is Sudanese. He wrote in the early weeks of October, basically saying his family had recently undergone some sort of massacre there, and he knows how difficult this is. And so there have definitely been these beautiful displays of solidarity, of people reaching out. I think there's a feeling in the Jewish community over the course of this year that we're alone.
Right.
But even though we've seen, significant challenges for some of our partners, we've also seen alongside that some beautiful signs of our lives being intertwined with others.
Interesting. So let's talk about that. So I was going to say, so this doesn't sound like 73 where everyone is kind of leaving you at the dance, but but there have been the hard stuff. So let's talk about the hard stuff. What's been the bad part of this? I mean, not the October 7th bad part, the global service bad part of it.
In addition to losing funding, which I described before, some of our partners who...
And just to be clear about that, you mentioned it in a glossy way before, or you glossed over, we said it briefly. So people are kind of since October 7th, we're more mad at Israel, so we're going to take away your funding kind of thing?
We've seen that. And then on the other side of this...
That's government organizations, or that's individuals, that's Jews,
it's usually we've seen the two sides of the spectrum. Jewish philanthropy that says, we love what you do, but we're investing our resources in Israel or in combating anti-Semitism, not in an Israeli organization that's doing work in global health in Ghana. Right. So we've seen that. And on the other end of the spectrum, we've seen general non-Jewish philanthropy saying that they want to sort of stay out of the political fray. If they had the choice between giving to said Israeli organization doing global health in Ghana versus non-Israeli organization doing similar things, they'd rather do that. And so that's definitely been a challenge.
Okay.
Some of our partners work in Muslim countries, and so that has been challenging to maintain those relationships, although I will say, for the most part, they have found ways to continue doing that. And then in addition to our partner organizations, we also have individual members. So Jews who work in the field of humanitarian aid, but outside of a Jewish context, in UN agencies, in large secular nonprofit organizations. And for them, this has been a really challenging time where they've experienced strained relationships with their colleagues, where many of them have felt that the communications that are coming out of their organizations are not in sync with their own values and or are not in sync with the value of impartiality and neutrality, which is core to the humanitarian sector. And so we've seen Jews who are sort of coming out of the woodwork, really looking for a community that embraces them for who they are. Proud humanitarians and proud Jews with ties to Israel, and doesn't ask them to check either their universal or particular commitments at the door.
Wow. Okay. And then it reminds me of, I remember right after October 7th, kind of friends who leaned left politically, kind of saying, like, I was there for my friends during BLM, I was there for my friends during Me Too, and I had, like, phone has been silent. You know, no one has reached out to me since October 7th, and feeling like they got, like, punched in the chin a little. Although it's different than what you're describing, because a lot of those were, you know, let's call it liberal Jews kind of entering into liberal causes and feeling like Jews are fine in America, let me help you with your cause. And this is a little bit different, because in this case it's like it was the Jews were actually serving, like, in those other places. They were going out there and doing that work, and waiting for, and there's not an expectation of those people to then serve in Israel, as you pointed out, but there's an expectation of solidarity. Okay, fine. Talk to me about women for a second. I feel like we've aired the film Screams Before Silence on JBS several times. You know, that felt, I think that's been another one that's kind of, people have been like, oh my God, you know, all these organizations are running to the aid of women that are under any kind of sexual assault or anything like that out there. And then here there was like a lot of silence when it came to Israel. How are your organizations experiencing that?
Understandably, that's been really rough and has felt like a betrayal to many people. Particularly the subset of our organizations and or our individual members who work on these issues. And they have been doing their best to try and change hearts and minds, but that has felt like a real betrayal.
Again, not there. That's so. It's a disaster. Are you? I know the answer. I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you have moments of doubt where you're like, "This is crazy. Why do I do this work? No one cares about us back."
No, I mean, it's interesting. I don't. I really believe that doing this work is an expression of deep Jewish values and not a renunciation of Jewish values. And I believe that we can't give Hamas a victory that they don't deserve.
Beautiful.
And for Jews and Israelis to stop doing good work around the world would be just that. And I think now is the time where you need Jews who are bridge builders, and who are transforming lives and fighting extreme poverty. I mean, we need that. And I also think that one of the things that has helped me as an Israeli who, in addition to the losses in our network, it's everywhere. So I know a lot of people who have been killed over this past year, is just watching the people in our network continue to do the work that they do. I'll share this story.
Please.
The woman who was taken hostage, who runs an organization in our network that works with farmers in East Africa. In those early weeks of the war, her organization was working around the clock. And they were working around the clock both because they were running all the efforts to try and raise publicity about her and her family, and also they were about to launch a new project in Rwanda. And when the acting director was asked, why do you keep doing this? He said, because if she comes back and discovers that we did not launch the project on time, we'll have hell to pay. Lo and behold, when she was released, he was among the first people to visit her in the hospital, and within 5 minutes, she said to him, so did you launch the project on time?
Wow.
And she actually came to speak at our annual conference years before. She was just a regular participant. And when she was there, she shared that in Gaza, she kept track of the days. And she knew the day that she was supposed to go to this ribbon cutting ceremony in in Rwanda. And she was in captivity together with 2 grandkids, an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old. And she basically devoted the day to telling them this whole story, that they had gotten on a plane and this is who they were going to see. And I've gotten really close to her since her release, and it's just been amazing to see how she simultaneously, while dealing with tremendous grief and the fact that her son-in-law is still in captivity, that she has been both trying to support her organization and has been involved in various efforts to secure the release of other hostages, to support other people from the Gaza envelope where she lived. And it's like people like that, if they can do this, then obviously I can do this. So no, I don't think I've questioned those core commitments.
I kind of guess that's where you would go. I'll ask a couple questions. One is, I want to pull out, because I kind of lumped it all together, which was not appropriate, right? It sounds like there's different areas, right? Helping people on the ground. It doesn't sound like you've had people where you're like, no one in Rwanda has been like, stop helping us, you're Israeli. It sounds like it's more been like the money behind it, or a philanthropist, or other partners of yours, other players in the global service are the ones that are giving you more of a hard time than the recipients. Is that correct?
With the exception of one example that I know, that I won't give the exact details because I don't want to give it away, but after an earthquake that occurred in the Middle East over the last 2 years, one of our partners has been involved in a deep relationship with the local government. It's an Israeli Jewish organization, but that was working with the local government, the health ministry. Parenthetically, I'll just say, I think most people who just read the headlines assume that organizations parachute in when there's a disaster and then leave shortly thereafter. But actually, that's not best practice. Best practice is to stay there for a period of 3 to 5 years, building resilience, and then to ensure that the local community can then take the helm.
So it's no good for college kids like me to go pop into Rwanda for 3 weeks, help out, meet some kids, go climb Kilimanjaro, and go back to school. That's not the most efficient way to save the world. I didn't know that. I remember,
but it may have impacted the way that you think about these things.
Well, that was
and
the knock. I remember, like in law school, everyone was kind of like, these are self-serving trips. They're not really helping the people. I assume that your organizations are robust enough that they're mindful of those things, because there's always the knock that, are you actually helping or are you serving yourself? But kidding aside, keep going.
So in this case, they were working with the local government.
Yeah.
After October 7th, the local government health ministry stopped answering their calls. And they understood, but they were deeply committed to this community. So they actually found a local Muslim NGO that was happy to continue partnering with them, and they're still working in that country. So there are examples of local partners that have said no, but for the most part, local communities they're in deep relationship with these organizations. They want those relationships to continue. Right.
Interesting. Okay, fine. So it's not that the world has turned their back, but some people that are in positions of philanthropy. Okay, fine. I want to ask you one more thing, which is, I don't know how to say this in a politically insensitive way, but I like one of the, I guess I'll say it this way. One of the tragedies, it felt like, there were many tragedies of October 7th, but one of them was this narrative that, let's call them, so many like peaceniks, so many global activists were the ones who were actually living right on the edge of the Gaza border, right? And they were ones who were like, had relationships across the border and were trying to send help over and taking care of people and all those kinds of things. And that felt like, I don't know, I feel like some people who are more small C conservative kind of felt like, this is what we've been saying the whole time. We were trying to help, and look what happened. Nothing good came out of this, so enough with trying to help. I know we've been talking mostly about, NGOs and organizations that are running to like far off places and aren't necessarily working with Palestinians, let's say, or with people living in Gaza, that kind of thing. How do you think through that challenge? And I know like right now it's raw. There's people who have literally lost their life and have been kidnapped, but like that feels like another question that's been raised by this. I'm not really asking a question, but I'm like bringing up the thoughts. What are your thoughts on that whole piece?
I know this is not what you were intending, but that line of argument blames the victim.
Please say it.
Meaning it basically says, you tried to do good in the world, you had it coming to you. I mean,
and God forbid not had it coming, but like.
But so I think.
But almost like a give up on trying to be nice to, in that case, Palestinians. I mean, again, it's a different example than going to Rwanda. There's no war, but like trying to help people understand. Yeah.
I think we have to distinguish between how people see diplomatic situations and the human-to-human contact of helping someone else and alleviating suffering.
Yeah, bring us into that, yeah.
And so, regardless of where you fall on the political map and, what you think that the policies in Gaza should have been and should be in the future, I think that the human-to-human connection, those people from the kibbutzim who drove Palestinians with cancer to hospitals.
Right. Wild stories, and these people are getting murdered. It's crazy. Keep going. Yeah, sorry.
But I don't think we should ever say that was bad or for naught. You mentioned Yitzhak Greenberg before. I just finished reading The Triumph of Life.
Oh, all right, great.
Which is amazing.
Yes.
And would recommend.
Yes.
I mean, that is the triumph of life, right? That is the best instinct in Jews and Israelis. Mm-hmm. So once again, if you put diplomatic solutions aside, the fact that these people did acts of chesed and helped save children's lives with cancer, I don't think we should ever question that. Right. And then I will also say an interesting development is that some of our partners who are simultaneously doing their work globally and also doing work in Israel with those most impacted, have also, at the invitation of Israeli authorities, been consulting and doing work around humanitarian aid delivery in Gaza. Which here too, it's interesting because the critiques, I think, in the past from the right were like, oh, you're rootless cosmopolitans, you should just help Jews. And from the left, why are you helping non-Jews far away? You should help Palestinians. And sort of what we've seen over this last year is that the heart is expansive and people are able to do this and this and this, even with all of the political sort of challenges, and doing it together with Israeli authorities that need this expertise, because Israel was never set up to do wars this long. We had the 6-Day War, we had the Yom Kippur War.
Right.
And so our partners actually have expertise that Israeli authorities need and have welcomed and have invited them in. And some of the very same people who have been serving in that consultative capacity are people also served in reserves in Gaza. And so it is people who are there's one person in our network, he's a commander, he lost 14 people in his unit, and he's working with Israeli authorities to ensure better provision of humanitarian aid to alleviate suffering in Gaza. So
I assume that's happening not while he's in the middle of war, that's when he's home from war.
That is when he's home from war.
He takes off his army gear and puts on his NGO gear and goes back to the same place and tries to have a different impact on the ground.
Correct.
That is wild.
And he also, in addition to losing 14 people in his unit, he also was wounded, and that will impact his functioning for life.
Oh my God.
So, I mean,
that's crazy.
It is crazy, and it is complicated.
Are there other people on the planet that are like this?
It is crazy, and it is complicated.
Yeah.
And I find it very inspiring.
Yeah.
And I don't think he's naive. Listen, he understands the complexities, but it's his way of navigating the different identities that he holds of someone who has gone around the world and has this area of expertise, but is also a proud Israeli serving his country. And I think for him, the work that he's now doing, consulting on this, is a different way of serving his country. He sees both of those as being part of that same identity.
Wow. That story will stick with me forever. That's totally crazy. I'm trying to remember his name. I once sat with a rabbi at a conference who told me, at the end of the day, when you look back on your career, as long as you always did the right thing, you'll never regret it. And I think what I hear you saying is, despite all the craziness in the world, Israel from the beginning has been convinced and committed to doing the right thing and trying to help people around the world, whether it helps them politically or not at certain times, even if it doesn't seem like it's going to. You have to stick with it. And now we are being totally like pressed to the most to see, are you really sure you want to do this? And you're saying, full steam ahead, we're going to keep doing this. And the last example you gave is even more extreme. So I want to say thank you. Thanks for coming on. I'm very inspired by the stories you're sharing. This should give all of us comfort that, we're continuing to do good both in Israel and in Gaza and around the world. May we come to a place where the Olam is Tikkun, where there's no more, where you go out of business. I hope you go out of business because we don't have to do it anymore.
Amen.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Okay.